There's a particular kind of person you've probably encountered, someone who seems to understand people on a level that's difficult to explain. They notice things others miss. They read a room the moment they walk into it. They stay calm when everything around them is falling apart. They feel deeply, trust carefully, and think in ways that seem almost compulsively perceptive. What most people don't know is where that capacity comes from. These abilities weren't built in a classroom. They weren't developed through meditation retreats or self-help books. In many cases, they were forged by something much harder: early experiences that required the nervous system to become extraordinarily sensitive, just to feel safe. Psychologists have begun calling this traumatic intelligence. And today, we're going to explore exactly what it is, what the science says about how it develops, and the 8 signs that you may have it. First, the premise, because it matters. Trauma is most often discussed in terms of what it takes from people: the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the relational difficulty, and those costs are real and worth taking seriously. But developmental psychology research tells a more complete story. Studies suggest that children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable or high-stress environments don't only sustain damage, they also develop adaptations. The brain, particularly in its formative years, is extraordinarily responsive to experience. When that experience involves navigating complex emotional environments, reading the moods of caregivers, anticipating conflict, managing instability, the brain reorganizes itself around that task. Specifically, 2 regions show significant development: the amygdala, responsible for emotional processing and threat detection, and the prefrontal cortex, which governs complex social reasoning and behavioral regulation. In people who grew up under emotionally demanding conditions, both regions are often shaped toward unusual sensitivity and sophistication. The result is a form of intelligence that doesn't show up on standardized tests, but runs remarkably deep in the real world. Here are 8 signs you may have developed it. Sign 1. You read a room before anyone speaks. You walk into a space, and something shifts inside you almost immediately. A quiet alertness activates. You register the tension in someone's posture, the micro-expression that passes across a face in less than a second. The emotional undercurrent running beneath a perfectly normal conversation. This is not mystical intuition. It's pattern recognition, and it's neurologically measurable. Research in social neuroscience shows that early exposure to emotionally unpredictable environments trains the brain to process nonverbal social cues with unusual speed and accuracy. Your brain was conditioned early to scan for emotional data because that scanning once kept you safe. The skill stayed long after the original threat was gone. Sign 2. You sense what others are feeling before they do. You notice when someone is struggling before they've said a word. You feel the shift in a person's energy before they've had time to process it themselves. You've probably finished the emotional sentence of a person who didn't even know they'd started one. Psychologists describe this as hyperempathy, a heightened attunement to the internal states of others. It frequently develops in people who grew up closely monitoring the emotional states of caregivers or family members, because that monitoring was functionally necessary. Your nervous system learned to feel others, not because you chose to be compassionate, though you may be, but because your environment made emotional tracking essential. Sign 3. You're exceptionally calm under pressure. When a crisis unfolds, something counterintuitive happens in you. While others freeze or panic, something in you steadies. You assess. You organize. You move. This is the nervous system doing something researchers find genuinely fascinating. Studies in adversity and resilience research describe a phenomenon called stress inoculation, the idea that repeated early exposure to high-stakes situations can actually calibrate the brain's stress response, making it more effective under pressure. High-stakes situations were simply your normal. Your nervous system adapted to them. What others experience as overwhelming, you process as a problem that needs solving. That isn't emotional detachment, it's a hard-won regulatory capacity. Sign 4. You think compulsively about why people do what they do. You replay conversations. You analyze motivations. You search for the meaning behind behaviors that others don't register as worth examining. Someone says something offhand and you're still turning it over 3 days later, not because you're stuck, but because you genuinely want to understand it. This depth of psychological thinking wasn't random. It was shaped by years of needing to understand the behavior of people whose behavior was difficult to predict. You became a student of human nature because understanding people felt connected to your sense of safety. The byproduct is an ability to anticipate how people will respond, what they're likely to do next, what they mean beneath what they say. In social and professional settings, this makes you unusually effective. You're often several steps ahead of a dynamic that others haven't even noticed yet. Sign 5. You've been called too sensitive or an overthinker. Pause on this one because it deserves a reframe. The perceptiveness, the empathy, the analytical depth, these have probably attracted certain labels over the years. Too sensitive, overthinking, intense, reading too much into things. Here's what developmental psychology actually says about those qualities. They are not weaknesses dressed up as strengths. They are genuine cognitive and emotional adaptations, evidence of a brain that responded to its environment with remarkable sophistication. What gets labeled as overthinking is often a mind that learned to think carefully because careful thinking once mattered. What gets labeled as too sensitive is often a nervous system that was trained to notice what others were conditioned to ignore. These aren't flaws with a silver lining. They're capabilities with a complicated origin story. Sign 6. You're deeply self-reliant, sometimes to a fault. You don't wait to be rescued. When a problem arises, your instinct is to solve it quietly, independently, without making it someone else's burden. People in your life are often surprised by how capable you are, because you rarely let them see the work. Developmentally, this makes complete sense. When childhood environments weren't reliably supportive, when asking for help felt risky, or simply wasn't an option, the brain adapted by internalizing resourcefulness. Dependence felt unsafe, so competence became the default mode. You learned early that your most reliable resource was yourself. The strength in this is real, but so is the cost, because the same self-reliance that protected you can make it genuinely difficult to let others in, to receive support, or to recognize when you don't have to do everything alone. Sign 7. You experience the world at an unusual emotional frequency. Music lands differently for you. Injustice doesn't just bother you intellectually, it bothers you in your body. A small act of kindness from a stranger can genuinely move you in a way you struggle to explain to people for whom it would have been forgettable. This emotional depth is one of the most consistent hallmarks of traumatic intelligence. The amygdala, which governs emotional processing, becomes highly sensitized through repeated emotional activation over time. The result is a person who doesn't just observe emotional experiences, they feel them at a depth and intensity that most people don't access. This can be a profound gift. It gives access to beauty, connection, and meaning that others skim past. It also comes with a real cost: emotional exhaustion, a tendency to absorb the distress of others, and a world that can sometimes feel like too much. Both things are true simultaneously. Sign 8. Your trust is rare, but when given, it's ironclad. Your threshold for trust is higher than average. Not because you're cynical, and not because you assume the worst of people, but because your brain learned early that signals of safety aren't always genuine. It built filters. Cognitive psychologists call this adaptive skepticism, a calibrated wariness, developed in response to environments where trust was sometimes misplaced or misused. Those filters can feel isolating. They can slow the formation of relationships and sometimes create distance from people who are genuinely safe. But they also mean something important. The connections you do form tend to be built on real foundations. When you trust someone, it's because they've actually earned it, and when that trust is given, it tends to be unusually loyal, honest, and durable. Traumatic intelligence is not a consolation prize. It's not a reframe designed to make difficult experiences feel better than they were. The experiences that forged these abilities were hard, often harder than they should have been, but the brain's response to those experiences is worth understanding clearly. It adapted. It developed capabilities that most people never build, because most people never had to. The perceptiveness, the empathy, the calm under pressure, the deep relational loyalty, these are real, they are measurable, and they belong to you. Understanding where they come from doesn't mean the past was okay. It means you see yourself and the remarkable complexity of how you became who you are with the accuracy you've always deserved. That's the psychology of traumatic intelligence. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Psychology Explained. We break down the science behind the patterns that shape who we are and how we experience the world.